thing I said, make sure you're asking questions. Okay. So I also will get this question because people coming late or they're not listening to me. I don't know. There's no curve on this exam. The average is right around where I like to see it. Right? Between the two sections, it was above a 75. So there was really no reason to curve. Once again, your guys' average was an 80. So above what I like to see. Okay. Any other questions for me logistically before we dive into module 10 material here? Yeah. So I said it doesn't factor in your CL points right now, and I haven't dropped any of your lowest scores yet. Yep. So I'll do that at the end of the semester, that week prior to, like, once all the quizzes are done, once all the module readings are done, I'll then start to update Canvas to drop your lowest scores. Yep. And to that point, we're back in the routine. Every Monday, what should we have? A module quiz and a module reading due. Okay, with the exception of that last week, we'll just basically be doing review before the final. Okay. Any other questions before we jump into material here? Okay. All right. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, just kind of setting us up for the types of markets we'll think about. Won't expect to see as many kind of questions on this, but we're going to start out thinking about a market and what a firm's, like in module 7, we did like consumer optimum. You almost think about now we're going to be looking at like firm optimums. Okay. So we're going to first start looking at a perfectly competitive market. These are going to be markets where we have many, many buyers and many, many sellers, right? So it's not like a monopoly, right? You probably heard this term where there was only one person selling gas in Bloomington. I have to buy it from them. Are they going to be able to get away with charging a higher or lower price? Higher, right? We're assuming that there's many competitors. So if one gas company starts to increase their price, you're just going to go to another one, right? That's the kind of market we're thinking about here. Many, many buyers, many, many sellers. Nobody has any control over the price. In subsequent modules, we'll start to talk about what happens if that's not the case. We got to walk before we can run. We got to understand these perfectly competitive markets first. Another kind of key crucial component of these markets, I mean, the first one I put is no barriers to entry. We're just in all these assuming there's no government intervention. So we're done with like subsidies and taxes for right now. We're just thinking about no regulation in this market. Anyone can start a business and or create a new firm if they want to. The other kind of key attribute is that we have a homogeneous product. Or technically, to be perfectly competitive, it needs to be perfect substitutes. The example I used to use like bottles of water, but we'll talk about in a later module how maybe that's changing. I think the best example of a perfectly competitive market is gasoline, because it has to be. If you go to the gas station, you're buying 87 unleaded gasoline. It's literally the exact same product. If I buy it from Marathon, if I buy it from Circle K, if I buy it, all these companies, they're all selling you the exact same product. Do you care where you get your gas from if it was the exact same price? No, right? It's the exact same thing. So I'll use gasoline in all the examples I give today and next class, because that's really our best thing to kind of anchor to what a perfectly competitive market is. Okay. So some things that they're not, I probably already kind of mentioned some of these in the last slide, but like we don't have any government intervention. So we don't have any legal restrictions to these markets. There's not like fees or permits you have to pay for. I was just somewhere this weekend where like you have to pay for like a liquor license. Well, essentially that's like a barrier to entry. I can't just start, a gas or a coffee store like that. I get a liquor license. So we don't have any of these legal restrictions or any of these barriers to firms kind of entering the market. We don't have any one firm being the only person who has gold or the only person that has all the gasoline reserves. None of that's going to be the case. Okay? We're just going to start out with these perfectly competitive markets. Many, many buyers and sellers. Nobody has control over the price, and they're selling the exact same product. Okay. With all that kind of being said, we're going to then think about, just like we were trying to understand, why did you do what you did? Why do you study for the certain number of hours that you did? Why do you choose to buy this many, cans of energy drinks or whatever it is, right? It's because you would choose to do something if the marginal benefit was greater than or equal to the marginal cost. You were trying to maximize your utility or happiness. What is a firm's happiness? Profits, right? Now, more specifically, we won't make this differentiation anymore, but we talk about two types of profits. What should the firm be focused on? Economic profit. So underneath all this, I get lazy with my language because we're always assuming that we are now looking only at economic profits. So the firm is trying to maximize their happiness or maximize their total economic profits. How do they do that? Well, they're not choosing the amount that they want to buy. They're choosing the amount that they want to produce. So what level of production would result in sales that generates the highest possible total economic profits for the firm? That's the goal. Okay. So if we don't have any control over price, right? We think about, usually we look at markets. So usually we have the supply and demand curve. Let me try to get zoom out of the way here for us. We were simply looking at where is the market price and what's the market quantity, right? So that was where supply was equal to demand. Now, when we're looking at a perfectly competitive firm, so I've got the market on the left, we're now going to be thinking about the quantity that the firm chooses. So if I want to know what quantity would the firm choose, so we said consumers, as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal, marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. What is the marginal benefit when I sell something? It's going to be the price, right? If it's a perfectly competitive market, I'm selling gasoline. If I try to charge a higher price than the gas station right across the street, what's everybody going to do? Buy from that gas station. So I have to charge that equilibrium price. Every unit I sell, the additional revenue I'll be making is whatever the price of a gallon of gas is. Right? So I think I chose 3 here, right? So when we're thinking about the firm's demand curve, it's going to be horizontal. I can choose a bunch of different levels of production, but I know that for every unit I sell, I'm going to be making whatever that equilibrium price is. So we can think of this firm's demand curve really represents what? All right. So we'll think about this firm's demand curve. And I'm going to jump the gun a little bit here, but I think it'll help kind of the flow of the class. We'll revisit some of this in other slides. So if I've got my market, and I've got supply, I've got demand, I've got my kind of current equilibrium price. Okay. If I'm thinking about what is the optimal quantity for the firm to choose, we said the firm, their demand curve is going to look something like this. Okay. So the reason why is because if we try to charge a price higher than this, how much are we going to sell? 0. So technically, if we want to be real technical, the firm's demand curve looks like this, right? If I charge any price in this range, I sell nothing. Once I start charging that equilibrium price, I can sell a different number of units. Okay. If I am thinking about a firm's total revenue, we said this was what? The price of the good I'm selling times the number of units I sell. So what if we're talking about marginal revenue? Anytime we want to look at marginal something, it's the change in that thing. So the change in total revenue divided by a change in, well, how are we generating revenue? We're selling 1 more additional unit or 10 more, whatever that change in quantity is. So if I think about it maybe differently for some of these who are math-minded, marginal revenue is just taking a derivative of this total revenue equation in respect to quantity. So if I do that, what am I left with? If I take a derivative in respect to quantity, simply the equilibrium price. So whatever that equilibrium price is, yes, that's the firm's demand curve, but that's the same thing as the marginal revenue of that firm. When they sell an additional unit, how much additional revenue are they making? Whatever that price is. So the firm's demand curve represents the marginal revenue of the firm, which is if a perfectly competitive market, I can't get away with charging anything other than the equilibrium price. That is the additional revenue I will make by selling 1 additional unit. Okay. So kind of 3 different ways of like referring to this curve. It's the firm's demand curve, which is simply whatever that equilibrium price is. And if it represents the amount of revenue I make every unit I sell, it's also their marginal revenue. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So if this is their marginal revenue, what happens if I see a demand increase in the market? So remember, this is my market, this is my firm. What's going to happen if I see a demand increase? The price goes up, right? So there's a demand increase, the price goes up. What's going to happen to the firm's demand curve? Well, the firm's demand curve is simply whatever that equilibrium price is. And it now represents that for every unit they sell, they're now selling at a higher price. So the additional revenue that they're generating from selling one more unit is now higher. So intuitively, do firms want to see a higher price or not? So this is where for the rest of the semester, we're putting ourselves in the mindset of a firm. If I'm a firm, do I want the price to be higher or lower? Why? Because that's essentially saying the amount of revenue I'm making every unit is now higher. Right? And then you can go through the same kind of thought process. What if instead I had something that increased supply? Well, what would that do? That would lower my price, which for the firm, that's going to lower their demand curve or lower their marginal revenue. Now, if I'm making less money off every unit I'm selling for a firm, this is a bad thing. So changes in the market, this is what we've talked about at this point. Things that shift supply and demand will change the equilibrium price. If firms are price takers, they can only get away with charging that equilibrium price. That now becomes their marginal revenue. So not the most interesting curve, right? It's a nice horizontal line, but it represents that if I want to sell this product, I have to charge the equilibrium price. If I don't, I can't sell anything. And why would I want to charge a lower price? Well, we could get into that. We'll get into that as we kind of progress through this module, why they wouldn't charge a lower price. Eventually, we'll kind of realize that, like, if I'm lowering the price, maybe I convince more people to buy from me, but there will be a point when we get to an equilibrium where if I lower the price, I'd just be decreasing my profits. So we're not quite there yet. But for right now, just thinking about, we're taking that price as given. Okay. Any questions on anything here before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So make sure I don't want to switch yet. Yeah. There you go. So I basically just kind of worked through this on the slides. We know if we have an increase in demand, what is that going to do? It's going to increase the firm's demand curve. Now that firm's demand curve represented what we called marginal revenue. So I kind of foreshadowed that a little bit. Doesn't show up in the slides. We're going to use this later on, just kind of go a little bit quicker through a future topic. So we've got changes in the market will impact the firms in that market. Okay. So the next thing we'll start thinking about is, okay, what was the whole goal of the firm? Was to maximize total economic profits. So one way we can think about profits in their most simplest form, if I took my total revenues and I took my total economic costs, the difference between those two are my total economic profit. So I have total revenues greater than my total costs. We'd say that a firm is earning positive economic profits, right? Or they're profitable. If they're the same, this is what we would call their breaking even. I have profits exactly equal to zero. Right? And if total revenue is ever less than my total costs, or I'm looking at like the accounting books, I have a loss or I have negative economic profits. Those are kind of our three ranges. Right? Now, we're going to talk about some things that kind of lead us back to these ranges to kind of have a nice visualization of them. But for now, I think this hopefully isn't too bad. Right? My total revenues are above my total costs. I'm earning positive profits. If they're less, my total revenues are less than my total costs, I've got negative profits. If they're exactly equal, my profits are exactly zero. Okay. Well, nothing too bad yet here. So if I show this to you in table form, if I think about bad at me. Okay. So every quantity is the total revenue minus total cost. What quantity would I have my highest profits at? If I'm just looking through these values, as I increase output, they keep going up. Here it's 9.5. What happens if I produce a quantity past 10? Total profits start to go down. So where's the maximum value of total profits? Right here. So I should be producing 10 units. So you can always just simply identify profits, total revenues minus total cost, and then figure out what quantity is that profit value at its highest point. Now, that's our first way of identifying kind of where profits are maximized. Now, from this table, we said marginal revenues are the change in my total revenues divided by a change in quantity. Well, here, what are my changes in quantity always? Kept it nice and easy at 1. All right. So if I were going, say, from a quantity of 2 to 3, what's the change in my total revenue? Going from 12 to, 8 to 12. So 4 divided by a change in quantity of 1, my marginal revenue is 4. What should the marginal revenue be at every quantity? How much money was I making off of every unit I sold? I had to charge the equilibrium price. So what is the equilibrium price here? Should be the same as my marginal revenue, which at every quantity, my marginal revenue here is 4. So I didn't tell you the price here, but just looking at the total revenue column, you know that if as I sell one more unit, if additional revenue I'm getting is $4, that must be the equilibrium price. Okay. So I know my marginal revenue is 4 here. Now, this is where, going back to module 9, how would I calculate my marginal costs? Marginal costs are the change in my total costs divided by a change in quantity. I could calculate my marginal costs at every quantity here as well, right? So like at 7, my marginal costs from 6 to 7 go up by what? 1.6 divided by a change in quantity of 1 would be 1.6. Now for marginal revenues and marginal costs, what changes if instead of going from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, I have 0 to 10 to 20 to 30? My denominator instead of change in 1 is now going to be a change in 10 or a change in 2, whatever those jumps in quantity are. Right? But we go through that kind of same thought problem. So just comparing total revenues to total costs, I can figure out here my total revenues are maximized at a quantity of 10. Okay. Any questions on this? Because we're going to make this a little more complicated here in a second. Okay. So I'm going to skip the graph I originally was going to put up here. I think it'll be more helpful. And then next class, if we have time, I'll revisit it. I don't want to confuse anyone. And the more I've thought about it, I think it's going to be better if we talk about this after we've talked through a little bit more things. But what I am going to do here, I left this slide blank, is try to give you a visualization of what's happening to my profits if instead I was to think about the marginal revenues and my marginal costs. Okay. So you guys can see this, right? Yeah. So if I'm thinking about, I've got this quantity, right? And I'm thinking about graphing out my marginal revenues and my marginal costs. Well, first of all, what's my marginal revenue? It's always the equilibrium price. So it was this kind of nice horizontal curve. What's my marginal cost curve look like from module 9? Initially, it might be decreasing because I have gains from specialization. Once my marginal cost starts increasing, I now know that what has taken over? Diminishing returns. If I'm trying to choose the optimal quantity of something, it should be where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. What is the marginal benefit of the firm? The additional revenue they're generating. So the optimal quantity, if instead I use marginal cost decision-making, should be the last unit where the marginal revenue was greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Marginal revenue is just the firm's marginal benefit. So it's very similar to what we were talking about when we had like consumer optimum. We're now just looking at firm optimum. Okay. Now, another way to think about this is, what are my profits? Total revenue minus my total costs. Okay. So what would the change in my profits be? So if I sell one more unit, the change in my profits would be however much my total revenues change by from selling one more unit minus however much my total costs change by from selling one more unit. So I can almost think about this as really saying my marginal profits, or how much my profits are changing by, is my marginal revenue minus my marginal costs. Okay. So in this range here, for every unit, what's true about my marginal revenue relative to my marginal costs? My marginal revenues are higher. So as I sell one more unit, I'm generating more additional revenue than I'm increasing my additional costs by. So for every unit in this range, if the change in my profits, right, when marginal revenue is above marginal costs, the change in my profits is positive. So what's happening to my total profits, right? So if I think about all these quantities, and I instead want to think about what are my total profits. Well, if I sell 0, what are my total profits? Assuming we're in the long run, I have no fixed cost, 0. As I start to sell these units, the change in my profits is going to be positive, so my profits start to increase. All right? Now, at a certain point, if I go past this quantity, what is now true? My marginal costs are what? Greater than my marginal revenue. So now my marginal profits are going to be negative. Or the change in my profits past this quantity, it's now going to start to go down. So where are my profits maximized? What's the highest value of my profits? Where the marginal revenue is equal to my marginal costs. Right? At every quantity before that, as I produce more, my profits are going up, or there's a positive change in my profits. At every quantity past this point, the change in my profits is negative, or my total profits are going down. Okay? So the point where total profits are maximized is going to be where the marginal revenue of the last unit sold is exactly equal to the marginal cost. Okay? So another way of thinking about this, at every quantity where marginal cost is above marginal revenue, my profits are going down. And at every quantity where my marginal revenue is above my marginal cost, my profits are going up. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here. I'll come back to this in a second. Right? So no questions on this before we go back to the slides. Once again, this is a building block for what we're doing the rest of the semester. Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump the gun a little bit here. So we'll take a step back and just revisit how did we calculate those marginal revenues and marginal costs? We just plotted them. But the marginal revenue is simply the change in my total revenue divided by a change in quantity. Just like before the exam, we talked about marginal costs or the change in my total cost divided by a change in quantity. So we can calculate these marginal values. So the optimal output rule, just like we had for consumers, I buy something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to marginal cost. Firms do the same thing. I continue to produce units as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. It's just now the marginal benefit for a firm is the marginal revenue, or we said the equilibrium price. So we get this kind of optimal production rule. We want to go to the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I'm saying this a lot. It's going to pop up throughout the rest of the semester, get it tattooed on your arm or something for the next exam. But this is what we're looking at. Okay? So are we going to make the same decision as we did before when we simply compared total revenue to total cost if we use the margins? Right? So I already wrote this out for you, but essentially that change in profits is the difference between our change in revenue and our change in costs. So if we look at this on a table, right? This is the same table we looked at before. I got my total revenue and my total costs. We said we could use those to calculate profits, right? And then we identified, well, this is the highest profit value. What if instead I calculated my marginal revenue column, which we said not the most interesting thing in the world because every unit I sell, the additional revenue should be the equilibrium price. So in this case, what's my equilibrium price? $4. Now, my marginal costs, we know are not always the same. Initially, what's happening to my marginal costs? What quantity do I stop having gains from specialization at? Well, as I go from 0 to 1, 2 to 3, what's happening to my marginal costs? They're going down. How did I calculate those marginal costs? Well, going from 1 to 2 units, the change in my total cost was 3, 9.8 to 12.8. Change in quantity was 1. 3 divided by 1 gave me, I'm looking at the wrong one. Sorry, 1 to 2, we were going to what? Oh, no, I got the wrong one. 9.8 to 12.8, which is 3, divided by 1 gave me that marginal cost of 3. And then I went to the next one, going from 1 to 2. I've got what? 15.2 minus 12.8, so 2.4 divided by 1 gives me that marginal cost of 2.4. Kind of calculate those all the way down. Well, marginal costs are decreasing all the way up to that quantity of 6. If I'm looking at this right, it's kind of hard for me to see it. There's a marginal cost of decreasing up to that quantity. Past the quantity of 6, what starts to happen to my marginal costs? They're increasing. So what must have taken over? Diminishing returns. Okay. So now that I have my marginal revenue, marginal cost, when marginal revenue is above my marginal cost, what should be true? Well, the change in my profit, if the marginal revenue is above my marginal cost, my profits should be going up, or the change in my profits is positive. Sure enough, when marginal revenue is above marginal costs, when I was calculating profits using total revenue minus total cost, whenever that's the case, my profits were going up. Now, they were still negative here. They were smaller negative values. Now, as I continue to produce, marginal revenue is still above marginal cost. My profits are still increasing. Here at that 10th unit, the marginal revenue is still above my marginal cost, so profits are going up. But if I go from that 10th to the 11th unit, now my marginal revenue is below my marginal cost. How much lower? $1.4. So if I go from the 10th to the 11th unit, my profits actually go down by $1.4. As soon as the marginal revenue is below my marginal cost, my profits from producing more will now start to decrease. So if I didn't have the total revenue and total costs, and I couldn't see this profit column, I would choose the optimal quantity where the last unit, so last unit where the marginal revenue was greater than or equal to the marginal cost, that would be here at a quantity of 10. Because if I went to a quantity of 11, now my marginal costs are greater than my marginal revenues.
Only works when the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue, like the whole minus just 1.4. No problems.
Yeah, the whole reason why the marginal cost is above marginal revenue, that the change in my profits is that difference, right? Is because the change in my profits was the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost. As soon as marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, I've now got that my change in profits would be a negative value, or that's how much they would decrease. Is that your? Yeah. Yep. So if we use this decision-making tool, we still end up identifying 10 was the last quantity where marginal revenue was greater than or equal to marginal cost, which is exactly what we did when we calculated profits. That's when we found they were the highest. So we can look at where total revenue minus total cost is at the highest value, or if I don't have the information, if I know the marginal revenue and marginal cost, I can still identify that same quantity. Now, I couldn't identify the value of profits, but I could identify that that quantity of 10 is where profits must be at their maximum point. Any other questions here? I'm going to add one more thing in here. So on a previous slide, I said the optimal production point is where marginal revenue is equal to my marginal costs. Is that true at a quantity of 10 here? Not quite, right? So just like when we had some of these consumer optimum problems, we don't have a truly continuous, like I can produce half a gallon of gas here, right? I'm like choosing integer values. So just limited to like a table, and we don't have a truly continuous line. I could do that, maybe take derivatives, but I don't think you want me to, right? Then it's the same idea that the last unit I will produce is the last unit where marginal revenue is greater than or equal to. In this case, we don't have an equal to point, but the quantity of 10 was the last quantity where marginal revenue was above the marginal cost. Once we got to the 11th unit, it no longer is, so we won't produce the 11th, we stop at that quantity of 10. So there won't always be an exact equal point. We still choose to produce something as long as the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Okay. Questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So kind of already jumped the gun a little bit here. But if I'm thinking about my marginal revenue, my marginal cost curves, the optimal quantity will be where that marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. Now, I kind of already did this as well, but I didn't talk through as much the intuition, and I think it's worthwhile. So let's assume, I'm going to do an example that's slightly different than what's in the slides, just so we get more examples here. Right? So when I'm drawing these graphs side by side, they look kind of similar because quantity is down here on the x-axis, but here we're thinking about the market. Right? So when I've got a market and it's currently in equilibrium, this is going to represent my market price. So let's say it starts out here. Well, if I'm in a perfectly competitive market, I have to take that price as given. We said this is the firm's demand curve or the firm's marginal revenue, which the amount of revenue I make for every unit I sell is whatever that equilibrium price is. Okay. Now, we also said, and here's where I'll just take away the gains from specialization portion of the marginal cost curve. I'm just going to focus on when we start to see diminishing returns. Because as long as we have gains from specialization, we should always want to produce more, right? We're just lowering our cost, marginal revenue is staying the same. So that's not usually a very interesting part of the curve for us to look at. So if I've got my optimal quantity here, let's say I saw something, and let's say it decreased supply. Right? If I decrease the supply in this market, what's happening to my equilibrium price? It's going up. So this is where, like in the next exam, I'm not going to ask you, if there's a tax in this market, what happens to the equilibrium price? But we could think about if there's a tax in this market, what happens to the optimal quantity that the firm produces? Well, if a tax increases the supply curve, essentially, right? Sorry, not increases, decreases our supply curve, right? Shifts it to the left. It increases our equilibrium price. So what happens? And tax might have been a bad example. I could think about maybe there's just like fewer producers, anything that shifts that supply curve. Well, my new firm demand curve will now be up here because that equilibrium price is higher. Now, what is the optimal quantity for the firm to produce? It's going to be at a higher quantity. Now, this is kind of nice because I think this is an intuitive result. If prices are higher, do firms like that? Yes. So are they going to produce more or less than before? More, right? So what's on our left-hand side? This is the market. Over here, this is the firm. So we're going to get to some tricky stuff next class, but just to kind of foreshadow, here's what is not an intuitive result. What happened to the quantity in the market here? It actually went down. How then is every firm choosing to produce a higher quantity? What must we have seen? Fewer firms. Some of the firms must have left this industry. So we'll talk more about that next class, but just in case you were kind of curious and we're looking through this, that can occur, right? The quantity in the market might change differently than the quantity for each firm, because when we're looking at the firm, we're assuming these are the remaining firms, okay? So we'll complicate this a little bit next class. For now, we just want to connect the dots of when the price changes in the market, how do firms respond, okay? And then I think on the slides, I did, instead of a supply decrease, what if we had a demand increase? Well, what is that going to do in the market? It's going to increase the price, right? Demand increases would increase that equilibrium price. If firms in a perfectly competitive market have to take that price as given, every unit they sell, the amount of additional revenue would be the equilibrium price. The firm's demand curve is going to increase, leading to the new point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, being at a higher quantity. So one thing I didn't put on these slides, but I'm typically writing it on all of the dot can work that I'm doing. Just like for the market, we said demand represented what? Marginal benefits to consumers. Well, when we're not looking at the market anymore, we're only looking at a firm. The firm's demand curve would represent the firm's marginal benefits. What is a firm's marginal benefit? Marginal revenue. And the marginal revenue is just the equilibrium price. So I was writing kind of marginal revenue next to the firm's demand curve up here. It's not on these slides, but really they're the same thing. The firm's demand curve is their marginal revenue curve. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep on moving here? Check an eye on time. Okay. Okay. All right. So we're okay with that. I'm getting a little bit tricky for a second. I won't make you reproduce this. We only care about where we start and where we end. Okay. But I don't like to tell you things and like you just have to take me as given, right? It's like an appeal to authority. I'm sure like just talking, I make mistakes with sometimes I use words that I'm pretty sure aren't real words. Just like talking quickly. So let's think about, I started out with profits. It was simply my total revenues minus my total costs. Okay. Total revenues we said was price times quantity. Now I'm going to do a tricky thing here. If I multiply my total cost by Q over Q, I multiplied it by 1. I didn't change anything. But I'm going to do this because if I now rearrange this a little bit, total cost over quantity is what? Module 9, my not marginal cost. It's not a change in my total cost here. It's my total cost divided by how much I'm producing. That would give me my average total costs. So I've got my average total cost, right, in parentheses there. Well, if I'm multiplying both of these things by Q, what can I do? Redistribute, pull it out front. I now end up with a form of my profit equation, which is it's the number of units I'm selling times the difference between the price and my average total cost. Okay. Now, why this works, to kind of give you a little bit of intuition as to what this actually represents. I think maybe this will kind of help some of you. So we ended up with this new, I shouldn't say new, but rearranged profit equation. Okay. Well, we said price is really what for the firm? In a perfectly competitive market, that's their marginal revenue. If it's always the same amount, this is really like my price is the per unit revenue. How much money I'm making off every unit I sell. In module 9, I said I can think of my average total costs as my per unit costs. Well, if I take the difference between my per unit costs and my per unit revenues, this is really like, you can think of this as representing my per unit profits. So if I take on average the amount I'm making in profits per unit times the number of units I'm selling, that would give me my profits. So, behind these equations are things that I think make more sense to us intuitively, right? The price is the firm's marginal revenue or their per unit revenues. The average total cost is my firm's per unit costs. So the difference between my per unit revenues and my per unit costs would be my per unit profits. If I take my on average per unit profits times the number of units I'm selling, that just gives me my profits. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So with that in mind, we'll keep moving here. So if I go back to my table, I took off my total revenue and my total costs, because that's how we were calculating profits. How can I still come up with those same profit values only given this information? Well, I know the price, right, is $4 here. I then went through, how did I calculate my average total costs? Right? I took my total costs and I divided it by quantity. So I didn't put the total cost column up here, but I went back and I used these total costs. How do I turn them into an average? I take the total cost and divide it by quantity. So 9.8 over 1 would be 9.8. 12.8 divided by 2, 6.4. 15.2 divided by 3 is what? 5 point something. If I'm doing math, am I correct? 5.066 repeated, right? So I just went through, calculated the average total cost. If I had the information, before we kind of get to this calculation of profits, just pointing some things out to connect the things we've already talked about. Initially, as I increase the output, what should my average total cost curve look like? It's shaped like a U. So initially, as I produce more, what's happening to my average total costs? They're going down, right? 9.8 all the way to 2.95. If I increase my production past that point, now my average total costs are going up. Or we could think about I had initially increasing returns to scale and then decreasing returns. So I've got this U-shaped cost curve. Now, what is also true, there won't be an exact equal to point here, but initially my marginal costs always start out below my average total. And marginal cost should hit my average total cost at its minimum point. This is what we talked about in module 9. So sure enough, my marginal costs are below my average total cost all the way up to, looks like here between a quantity of 9 and 10 is where it would intersect that average total cost curve. Now that my marginal costs are above the average, my new average starts to get higher. So same thing plays out as what we were talking about in module 9 with our costs. Now, if I wanted to then calculate my profits, I look at the difference between my price and my average total cost, and I multiply by the quantity I'm producing. So here, I would have what? 4 minus 9.8. So that's what? 5.8 times 1, negative 5.8. The difference between price and average total cost here is 2.4 times the number of units I'm selling. 2 would give me negative 4.8. I said 2.4, right? It's negative since the average total cost is above price. And then I kind of just keep going through doing that all the way down. If I'm looking at where is marginal revenue greater than or equal to marginal cost, the last unit we said earlier was 10. So if I wanted to calculate profits here, if I've got the price, got my average total cost, the difference between those represents my per unit profits. So what? 4 minus 3.05 is 0.95. I then multiply that by the number of units I'm selling, 10, and I would get my profits are 9.5, which is exactly what we found earlier, simply using total revenues minus total costs. So either one of these equations should produce the exact same values. So I can look at total revenue minus total cost, or I can look at where marginal revenue is greater than or equal to my marginal cost, that last value. If I calculate profits here by price minus average total cost times the unit number of units I'm selling, I get that exact same value as I was finding before. Okay, so just a different way of calculating profits. Now, the reason why we do this is I'm going to show you a visual in a second. This second equation lines up a lot more with what we're looking at on graphs. And once again, it's kind of more intuitive in that I'm thinking about like per unit revenues, per unit costs. And so that's often why we'll want to use this version of the equation. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving here? Keeping an eye on time. So I've got some stuff in the slides. I'm going to reproduce this by hand, and you can always go back in the slides. I don't know. I put time into my slides and they're great, but I'll probably use them to do more review at the beginning of next class. And I think sometimes seeing how you would draw this out physically can help. Okay. So let's say I start out. Well, yeah, I'll do it this way. So let's say I've got here. So I've got my quantity in the market. I've got this equilibrium price that comes from where supply is equal to demand. We said that price is going to be my firm demand curve or the marginal revenue of the firm. So let's think about a scenario where I've got my marginal costs here and I've got my average total costs right here. Okay. So where is the optimal quantity for this firm to produce? Well, where does marginal revenue hit marginal costs? That's going to be out here at this quantity, right? So this is our quantity for the firm. Okay. Well, we said before, our profit equation, the other form we can use, is the difference between our per unit revenues, our per unit costs. This represented like our per unit profits. Multiply that by the number of units we're selling, and that gives us our total profits. So if I think about here, at this optimal quantity, here's my marginal revenues or the price of the good. At that quantity, here is my average total cost. That's the point that I'm at on my average total cost curve. Well, notice, what's the height of this rectangle? Price minus average total cost. What's the width of this rectangle? The quantity I'm selling. This rectangle actually represents that firm's profits. Okay. So we use the equilibrium price in the market. That's the firm's marginal revenue. We then identify that profit maximizing quantity, where it was the last unit where marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. At that quantity, we know the price. We can now find the average total cost. Now it's just a matter of plugging that in. That rectangle would kind of represent our profits. Any questions here before we keep moving? So not to muddy up this graph too much, I'm then going to look at one more thing. So we started out here with positive profits, right? Price was above my average total cost, right? So this was not only profits, we knew profits were positive here. Okay? Let's think about if we had a similar depiction, but I want to start to think about how would changes in the market then start to change things. So I want to try to get these at the same point. So we're roughly here. So here's my average total cost. Here's my marginal cost curve. And initially, we had the equilibrium price or the firm's marginal revenue up here. Okay. We identified what profits were. Now instead, let's assume that there's a change in the market. Okay. So if there's a change in this market, and let's say what do I want here? Let's say I see a decrease in demand. Okay. What is that going to do to my equilibrium price? Lower it. However, I'm not, trying to map this out. Here's the market. Here was the firm. Here's just another depiction of the firm, right? Just to kind of keep these ideas separate. Identifying profits. What happens if the price decreases? This now becomes the firm's. They take that price as given. This is their new demand curve or the firm's marginal revenue. So when the price is lower, before we even identify this, intuitively, our firm's going to want to sell more or less than before. Less. If the marginal revenue is lower, notice the new optimal quantity for the firm has done what? So this was kind of our old marginal revenue. It has went down. Now let's kind of think about why. For every unit in this range, what used to be true? The marginal revenue used to be above the marginal cost. So for these units, the change in my profit used to be positive. Right? Those were good units for me to sell. After the price change, it's now lower. For all of these units, what is true about my new marginal revenue relative to those marginal costs? It is now lower. So the additional revenue generated from these units is now less than the additional cost. Now those units that used to generate positive profits are now generating negative or decreasing my profits. So that's why we then see the firm choose this lower quantity, because these quantities before used to be generating positive profits. They no longer are. Price or my marginal revenue is now below my marginal cost in that range. Okay. Now, once again, intuitively, if the price is lower, I'm not going to want to produce as much as before. That's like an easy, not understanding the kind of mechanisms as much, but that kind of end result, I think, is fairly intuitive here. Okay. Any questions before I add one more thing in here? So if I'm using this profit equation, what are profits now? Still the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost. Well, at this quantity, here's my price. Here is that average total cost, the difference between price and average total cost, times the quantity I'm now selling. This now represents my profits. However, price now is below average total cost. So now my profits are going to be negative, right? If I stay open, even though there is a profit maximizing quantity, at that profit maximizing quantity, my profits are still negative. Now that can occur. Just because we're selecting the optimal quantity, it could be that is still the point where I've maximized profits. But if profits are negative and I've maximized them, it's like I've chosen the smallest possible loss, right? So this is where when like firms operate and you look at the accounting books and you're like, they're earning negative profits. Why are they doing that? What do they hope happens? They're currently earning negative profits. They hope that instead of a price decrease, the next few years, they see a price increase or something in the market changes that drives that price up. And even though I might be incurring losses for the first 5 years of my business, if I recoup those in the next 10, I could be net, overall better, right? We're looking at kind of per year decisions. We still could be maximizing profits even though profits are negative, right? I could just be holding out for things that I hope or I think are going to change in that market over time, okay? And firms aren't playing short run games, they're playing long run games, right? They worry about profits over the next 50 years. I mean, they care year to year, but right, I'm really worried about what is the outcome of my company going to look like over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Got two more things I want to mention here. So one, I was thinking about this, what would So what would be another thing that could cause prices to increase? What if I had supply decrease and I drove the price up? Well, if lowering the price, I went from positive to negative profits, potentially if I increase the price, I could go from negative to positive, or I could go with positive to even larger positive profits. So I've been thinking about this recently, like all this tariff stuff, like because the price of gas went up by like $1.50 over the past like couple months, right? Like, it's insane, right? So the price went up. Who do you think really likes this? Gas companies, right? They could have been operating with negative profits after this price increase. They now might be having positive profits, right? Now, we talked about this weird concept that we'll dive into next class, which is the existing firms might now have positive profits, but if there's a lower quantity in the market, we could see fewer firms. So the firms that left the market don't like these higher prices, right? But the firms that remain like them. Right? So we'll kind of talk more about that next class. I just wanted to kind of talk through some like connecting to like real world examples here. Now, I talked about positive, negative profits. What's a third option? Profits could be zero. So what would that have to look like? So if my profits are equal to zero, what would have to be true about price and average total cost? As long as I'm producing a quantity that's positive, they'd have to be the exact same thing. So if I'm thinking about if I make decisions based off of when price, which is marginal revenue, is equal to marginal cost, but price has to be equal to average total cost for profits to be equal to zero. If we had zero profits, what would have to be the case? Well, where does marginal cost equal average total cost? At its minimum point. So it'd have to be the price hits my marginal cost right at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. In this case, now my profits are equal to zero. We kind of have those three different scenarios. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah. Yeah, so we'll go through this a little more next class, but it's a good question. So what type of profits are we talking about? Economic profits. So when we actually look at the accounting books, these firms would all have positive profits, accounting profits, because they don't factor in the economic costs. Well, what are economic costs? It's basically if I took all of my resources and instead of producing gasoline, I produce something else. So total economic profits could be zero, and I could still be maximizing the overall level because there's nothing else that could provide me with higher economic profits. So when economic profits are zero, it essentially is saying I'm choosing to do with my resources the thing that can generate the most profit. Right? Because once I factor in those economic costs or what I could be doing, the only way when I'm currently doing this bad is if my economic costs start to become negative. So we'll see that the long run, where do we actually see all firms end up at? This point. Because if I had positive negative profits, if I have positive profits, what do other firms want to do? Well, their opportunity cost of producing instead of gasoline, bottles of water is much lower. So they want to jump into that market. And then if there's negative profits, those firms want to get out of that market, right? And so this kind of exists over time until we see now there's zero economic profits. There's no incentive for firms to enter or exit these markets. Now this is where we get to like a philosophical, theoretical, like what is the long run, right? Because continuously things are changing. And so do we ever actually get to the long run? Not really, right? There's like a, once again, it's more like a logic kind of philosophical kind of question, but we move that direction. We see markets move towards that long run outcome. Any other questions here before we keep moving? Okay. So one more thing, and we'll talk through this. So I think I have this set to be at the end of class. Let's just double check. So I think the code is 79.65 for today. Yeah, I've got it set to be the end of class. We'll kind of work through these together. Once again, in-class attendance is important. I think these questions are good to review on your own. But for those of you who show up, I think it's valuable for you to kind of see me work through these as well for the first time, right? But these are always good questions to go back and make sure, even if I give you the answers, you know how to provide or produce a solution as to why it's correct, okay? So let's think about this first one. So these were incorporating some stuff we didn't quite get to today, but they help me introduce the next topics for Thursday's class. So I've got 3 cost curves up. Now, we didn't talk about one of those curves today. So we had marginal and average total cost today. What curve did I leave off that we see in the short run? My average variable cost. If I was identifying these, what does that black curve have to be? Average total, right? Why? Well, this blue curve is intersecting these at their minimum point. What intersects my average total and average variable cost at its minimum point? My marginal cost curve. So this blue curve is my marginal cost. Now, the reason I know this black U-shaped curve is my average total is because my average total is always my average variable plus my average fixed. So it has to be above my average variable cost curve. So the green curve is our average variable cost, black is average total, blue is my marginal cost. So what would represent the point where profits are equal to 0 or go from being negative to positive, or what we'll end up calling next class our break-even point? Well, we just said what point is where profits are equal to 0. We end up at the minimum point of our average total cost, or where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost is exactly at a point where the price is equal to average total cost. Well, price is marginal revenue. Marginal cost hits average total at its minimum point. So when the price is equal to the minimum point of our average total cost curve, we have 0 profits. Where would that be at here? Looks like a price of 425. And the quantity the firm would choose would then be 350, if I'm following this down correctly, right? So that break-even price and quantity is going to be the price at which we would end up choosing a quantity that is at the minimum point of our average total cost. So if marginal revenue or the price of the good here was 425, what would the optimal quantity be? Well, it would be where that price or marginal revenue is equal to my blue line, my marginal cost. And then at that blue line, how do we calculate profits? It was the difference between price and average total cost, but those are now the exact same value. So that difference is 0, my profits would be equal to 0. And then what quantity does that correspond to? A quantity of 350. Okay. So our break-even kind of quantity and price there, we've got a quantity of 350 at that price of 425. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Now, if the price were, say, above 425, like 500, well, now where would my price or my marginal revenue hit marginal cost? Somewhere up here. Price is now above my average total. So there my profits would be. Price is above my average total cost. That difference is positive. My profits are positive. So essentially, I've got this break-even price. Intuitively, if the price gets any higher, is that a good or a bad thing for firms? Good. So as the price goes above that break-even price, my profits are going to be getting larger, become positive. If the price ever falls below that break-even price, lower prices, is that a good or a bad thing for the firm? So profits are going to go from being 0 to negative, right? Any price below this, say 300, my price or marginal revenue hits marginal cost down here. Price is now below average total. I'd have negative profit. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So the second question is something we didn't quite get to today, right? But it leads us into next class, what we're going to think about. So I've got my average total, average variable, marginal cost. What if the price was $125? Well, if I've got a price of 125, it gets a little bit tricky here, but it looks like it intersects this marginal cost curve in two places. Now, the first point we won't care about. So why? Because as long as we have gains from specialization, as long as that price remains constant, well, if I keep producing, that price is now above the margin, I still have a lot of positive profits that I can make, right? So we're always just going to focus on where does that price hit the part of our marginal cost curve that we've got diminishing returns. So that looks like it's out here at what? Then scrolling up. So that's out here at what? A quantity of 225. All right. So if this is 225, is that price of 125? It's well below my average total cost curve. So I've got huge negative profits. Now, if I have negative profits, the next decision I have to make, well, if I keep producing and I have negative profits, what might I want to do? I mentioned earlier, get the hell out of that market. All right. So once we know profits are negative, the next choice that we have for firms is, do I continue to produce? If I stay in the market, will I be minimizing my losses? Or would, in fact, would minimizing my losses actually be to produce 0 and get out of that market completely? So that's kind of the next decision. We have now identified positive, 0, negative profits. If we're in that negative profit range, the next step of the decision-making process for a firm is, do I stay open and actually minimize my losses by staying open? Or would I minimize my losses by just getting out of the market? Kind of a little bit of a foreshadowing. What would my losses be if I left the market? Now, in the short run, my variable costs become 0, but what do I still have to pay? The fixed costs I'm linked into. So we're going to start to compare basically what our profits would be if we stayed in the market to, well, what are our profits if we leave? Negative fixed costs. All right. So we'll kind of pick up on that next class. So here, what we'll find out is in this scenario, we should actually get out of the market or produce 0. We'll talk about why on Thursday. The third question we'll kind of revisit. You don't have to respond to the third question. When I get back to my office, I'll get these in-class quizzes regraded. So you just have to get those first 2 correct to get the full points. Okay? Is that clear what I'm saying there? Hear a lot of muttering, so yes. So make sure you're getting this submitted by 10:50. That's when the due date time is. If you don't, I'll assume you weren't here. Otherwise, office hours tomorrow, and we will meet again in class on Thursday.